Council Chair, council members, and participants, we are now live.
Thank you. I just want to first give a shout out to Modesto and the tech team and the city for making all these things possible these last 18 months. Without you guys, we wouldn't be having these hearings. So thank you so much for all your work. It's great. So good morning, everyone. This hearing is called to order. I recognize the presence of a quorum of committee members of the committee in attendance. I know there'll be some of them coming on board. And this is a public hearing of the Committee on Fiscal Responsibility and Intergovernmental Cooperation. And the purpose of this public hearing is to hear testimony in Resolution 200-406. I understand that state law currently requires that the following announcement be made at the beginning of every remote public hearing as follows. Due to the current public health emergency, City Council committees are currently meeting remotely. We're using Microsoft Teams to make these remote hearings possible. Instructions for how the public may view and offer public testimony at public hearings of council committees are included in the public hearing notices that are published in the Daily News, Inquirer, and Legal Intelligencer prior to the hearings, and can also be found on phlcouncil.com. The clerk will now please read the title of the resolution before the committee today.
Good morning. The resolution being heard today is authorizing the Committee on Fiscal Stability and Intergovernmental Cooperation to hold quarterly hearings that include monthly reporting requirements to discuss the fiscal position and overarching social impact goals of the city, including and as related to the 5-year plan and the reporting requirements set forth in the quarterly city manager's report, as submitted to the Pennsylvania Intergovernmental Cooperation Authority.
Thank you. I'd like to recognize also Councilman Jones, who joined us. Good morning, Councilman Jones.
Good morning. How are you, Chairman?
Good. Thank you for being here. And also Council Member Maria Canona Sanchez has joined us. Thank you, Council Member.
Good morning.
Good morning. And Councilman Mark Squilla, thanks for joining us. So, good to see you. I want to thank everybody for being here. I'm not going to give any kind of speech. I think we should get right to the heart of the topic. So let's start with our first panel, which I believe is Harvey Rice and Bob DeBoe and Marissa Wax.
Good morning, Councilman Dom and members of the City Fiscal Stability and Intergovernmental Cooperation Committee. As you know, my name is Harvey Rice. I'm the Executive Director of Pennsylvania Intergovernmental Cooperation Authority, which is the state oversight agency for the city of Philadelphia. Again, I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to testify today and to speak about PICA's report and the quarterly city manager's report for the fourth quarter of fiscal year 2021, which encompassed the April, May, and June months, as well as PICA's recent reports on city revenues, obligations, and overtime through August, and also our recent comparison of the reserve and fund balance with other cities throughout the United States. I have prepared because of time constraints, a short PowerPoint presentation with the highlights of the reports that I just mentioned. Okay, the numbers. This is for the last quarter of FY 2021. The fund balance was projected in the 5-year plan of 51.3. It's projected for the last quarter to rise to 78.8 million. And if you look at compared to last year, how significantly lower it is, it was almost 300 million projected, the actual of last FY 2020. And it also must be noted that out of that 78.8 million, 26.5 million is money from the ARP money from the federal government. Revenues was projected at 4.615 billion. The actual is 4.833 billion. So that was higher, but also that includes federal money in those numbers. Obligations was projected at a little under 5 billion. And the actual is just a little over 5 billion. These are the just another slide on the revenues and obligations.
Mr. Rice, can I just go
Yes.
back to your first
Sure.
slide to make sure we all understand? So, yeah, that one. In this slide, it's saying the revenues were projected for 21 are 4.6. And
Right.
it's the actuals for 20.
20. I misspoke. Yes.
Okay. Just want to make
Was
sure.
4 point.
So just to be clear from this slide, so I make sure I understand this, the fund balance this year is almost 212 million lower than it was last year.
Yes. Yes.
And revenues will be almost whatever that differential is, like 150 million or more.
Yes.
Actually, 200
Right.
200 and just doing the math in my head, 220 roughly less in revenue.
Yes.
And the obligations though are lower by about 119, 18, 17 million roughly.
Roughly. Yes.
Okay, so I just want to make sure we're okay. Thank you. I'm sorry to interrupt.
You're welcome. These are the. This slide shows the projected revenues and obligations, not only compared to last year, but compared to the 5-year plan. So you can see that in revenues, the 5-year plan projection was 4.5 billion, and the Q4 projection rose to 4.6 billion. And same with obligations, we see the actual of FY20 at a little over 5 billion. The 5-year projection for FY21 was lower at 4.8 billion, but it comes in at the fourth quarter projection higher than the 5-year plan projection by what we just discussed, about $120 million. This just shows that this slide that the revenues were projected to increase by 33 million from the 5-year plan for the last quarter of FY21. Obligations almost 115 million from the 5-year plan for the last quarter, and the fund balance, as I discussed, was 78.8 million projected for the last quarter. Increase of over 27 million from the 5-year plan, as I also mentioned, due to the influx of the ARP funds. And this slide just shows you revenues by type of the different categories of revenues. And as you can see, the revenues that took a hit during the fourth quarter and during actually the whole year of FY21 were parking, amusement, beverage, wage and earnings, took the biggest hit, and that's mostly due to the refunds for non-Philadelphia employees that work for companies or in the city. And then we look at staffing, and it's continuing to decline through the months and the year and a half of the pandemic. And then overtime declined also by about 11% over FY21 over FY20. And then this slide shows you by department overtime for 21s compared to overtime for FY22 through August. So these are the more updated numbers on overtime. This is August of FY22. This is the fiscal year that we're currently in.
Yeah,
and then we look at, I'm sorry, Councilman.
We have a question from Councilmember
Sure.
Jones. Do you want to ask a question on one of the slides?
I'd rather wait until the end of his presentation,
Okay.
Mr. Chairman.
And then we look at performance targets and measures. This is since the pandemic, it's been very hard because targets and performance measures are constantly changing a lot because of the pandemic, and to fulfill the needs and the services that were needed during the pandemic. But we're still looking at them, and we're looking forward to when the city gets back through the pandemic, and then we can better assess the targets and the performance measures that each department puts forward in the plan and in the quarterly reports. So we also looked at, we follow the tax revenues monthly, so we wanted to give you an update through August, which is the last ones that we reported on. And as you can see, we're slightly below in revenues collections from August of 21 to August of 22. Through year to date, we're year to date we're about 10% lower, about $44 million. And then obligations again, we report through August. If you look at FY22, which is the current year we're in, we're slightly above FY22. But as we've noticed since we've been monitoring the budget obligations since the beginning of the pandemic, that the early months you'll see more obligations and more payments because of debt service and encumbered contracts. And then at our annual meeting in July, when the board considered and approved the plan, it was requested by the board they were concerned about the low fund balance and the very few reserve contributions over the course since the Budget Stabilization Reserve Fund was established. So PICA staff reviewed 18 cities that have reserve funds in the United States. So we looked at the reserve funds, how they come to the reserve fund, how they contribute to the reserve fund, and we also looked at their fund balances. And what we found, and this is just one slide of our report that we issued last week, that Philadelphia is both near the bottom and to get the best way to compare, because it's not apples to apples. Each city has a different way of coming to their fund balance, and also different ways of contributing or criteria for the reserve funds or rainy day funds. So we looked at their, we went to every city's comprehensive annual financial report, the CAFR report, and looked at the unaudited numbers that were left for the fund balance, and compared that to other cities, and then and as a percent of obligations for both the fund balance and the budget stabilization reserve or rainy day fund. Different cities call it different names. And that's how we came up with this data and this information. So as you can see on the reserve funds, and we looked at 3 years, 18, 19, and 20. I'm showing you they were very similar in each of the 3 years. This slide is for FY20. As you can see in the reserve funds, the city is low, third at the bottom of the 18 cities. And the fund balances were also low, number 5 on fund balances. So what we reported is that where other cities had very high fund balances, or they had criteria measures to put for a reserve fund, that when tough times hit, they can go and have something to fall back on to get them through that event. whether it's the pandemic, whether it's in New Orleans, if they had a rainy day fund for the hurricanes, or like Portland has it for high unemployment. So as we've been saying all along in our annual reports, the need for the city to have a rainy day fund and commit to contributing to that fund, so that when events such as this pandemic hits, which we were at that point, we had over $34 million, which was used the following year for to help us through the pandemic event. So so that's my presentation. Feel free to answer any questions that you may have.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Rice. Can we go back to, I want to make sure I'm clear. There was a chart you showed of revenues and expenses, how we're doing this year, and I think our revenues were up like 33 million on the chart, and the expenses were up like 80 or 85 million. I think it's before this one. Before that one too. Before that. Before that one. Before that one. There you go. Well, this is, I just want to make sure I understand. So I don't think this was it. There was a chart that showed that for this year on a projection for 21, because this chart's not showing the projection or the actual for 21, right? This is just showing the projection. Do you have the actuals for 21 of income and expenses? And if you don't, you can just...
we can go through August.
Yeah, that's fine. But if I recall, it's 33 million or so income is higher than what we projected, but the expenses were 85 million higher. Does that sound right, accurate?
Right, and here's the expenses. So the expenses are also higher.
Yeah. And so that shortfall, is that getting covered by the federal funds?
It's too early to tell. Because it's early in the year. As we go through each month, then we can have a better sense.
Okay. And then the other question I had is the reserve fund. What's PICA's recommendation in this environment on how we can build up that reserve fund? What does PICA recommend we do? What's the...
Well, I think what we found was like certain cities such as Houston and I believe LA, they have it where if they dip into their fund, then so Houston I think has a 15 million or 25 million they have to have in that fund. So if they dip into that and say in 21 and they take 10 million out of that, then in FY22, their budget, they have to put that money right back in there. So they have to keep it at that level. So that's one idea. Some cities look at the rate of revenue growth, so that if it's over a certain percentage, and they all have different percentages, some at 2.5 up to I think 4.5, so that if their revenues come in over, or they're projected to come in over that, then that percentage of that overflow is then put into a reserve fund. So that basically goes to the point when in good times, you want to save and prepare for the times that aren't going to be so good, or that events will come into play that you might need extra funds to get through that period. So so there are just some examples of how the other cities contribute or have the criteria for their so-called rainy day funds, reserve funds, and I would recommend that the city look at our report and some of the we don't have recommendations in there, but some of our findings and our conclusion, and see if it's in the city's interest right now to tweak or change some of the criteria to ensure that since the BSR has been in place since 2011, it's only made one contribution in 10 years, and that maybe these new ways or ways of the other cities looking at it might we might be able to increase that contribution over the next 10 years.
Well, the chair would like to recognize Vice Chair Brian O'Neill joining the meeting, Councilmember Kathy Gilmore Richardson, Councilmember Derek Green, and Councilmember Kendra Brooks. Thank you. And Councilmember Jamie Gautier, too. Thank you very much. I do have a question for you, Mr. Rice. Second one. Then we're going to go to Councilman Curtis Jones. These reserve funds that we're talking about are all cash reserve funds, correct?
It's fund balance.
No, it's fund balance. So
They're liquid assets, basically.
right. The reserve fund is. If you're putting money into the reserve fund, yes, that's liquid. That's money that's put into that separate fund that the city, following their criteria, can pull out either all of it or whatever fits in the criteria. Yes.
Is there any value to assets the city owns that are not liquid, such as real estate and other assets? And I'd be curious as to know how Philadelphia compares to other cities as far as owning those types of assets, to see, because when you look at a financial worth of a city, it's not just the cash and reserves, it's also the assets the city has.
We didn't look, as part of our review, we did not look at that. It's maybe a possibility that we could look at if that data is available.
Okay, thank you. Councilman Jones, I know you had a question. The chair would like to recognize you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And thank you for staying focused on our fiscal stability in these times. I cannot imagine a greater time that we should be laser focused on revenues and obligations as we are right now in this point in time. My question would be, we would be having a very different conversation right now, but for the federal bailouts that we had. And I want to recognize that we did receive them and that it has helped us out. How would you say the bond ratings will be impacted by our current snapshot status fiscally?
One of the things that the bond rating agency look at when they're making their grade for the city is the amount that's in the fund balance. So low fund balances are not good for they're not looked kindly by the bond rating agencies. So that's why if every year in our annual staff reports on the 5-year plan, we mention that if the fund balances are low, what effect that might have on the city's bond rating. As you saw right before the pandemic, the city was doing really well, maybe not meeting the GFOA recommendation of 17% of obligations, but the city's own, they were meeting for a few years their own 6 to 8% target of revenue. So they had their fund balances right before the pandemic were very high, were over 400 million. So now when we received the 5-year plan in July, the numbers were significantly lower, and as in discussions with bond rating agencies, they look at as I said, the amount that's in a fund balance for the city, because that shows the financial consistency of the city going forward, just in case some events happen, that they have a fund balance that they can use to adjust to those events.
Second thing I would ask about in your report is the overtime utilization charts. In light of a pandemic, in light of departments that I know had large shortages of workforce, whether we're talking about the police department, whether we talk about the prisons in particular, they're undergoing severe outages and therefore reliant, in order to maintain operations, overtime. So is that being considered and adjusted for due to COVID and due
Yes,
to?
yes, it is, Councilman. We're just reporting what the numbers are, but we understand, and as I had mentioned again with the performance measures, this is not a typical year or a typical year and a half, and that we need, we're just reporting to the council and to the public what the numbers are. But yes, when you have in the prisons, for example, where you have many of the employees who are sick and not coming in, and then to make sure that you have enough staffing to fulfill the mission and the federal mandates on the prison. Yes, you need overtime. You need overtime in other departments such as the police. So we're well aware of that, and the board is well aware of that. They've mentioned that at board meetings also, that while we're concerned, and we were concerned prior to the pandemic about rising overtime costs, we're right now at the stage where we're just reporting the numbers, and then as we get through the pandemic, then we'll see whether those overtime numbers decrease.
So this final question, and I don't know if so other cities are all different. They calculate differently, as you mentioned.
Yes.
But how many of them comparable, I'm gonna say from New York to LA, the top 10, how much relief did they get from the feds compared to us? And then I want to zero in on our state relief. Commonwealth of Pennsylvania currently has a $5 billion surplus. And if you were asking on our behalf how they could help us, what would be your recommendation for that kind of assistance? Would it be in a fund balance? Would it be in our school district needs? Would it be job creation tools? What would you recommend?
Well, two areas I would recommend. One is that if they can make contributions to the city's general fund to cover the cost of needed services that the citizens of Philadelphia expect and deserve, then therefore, if they can cover some of those costs, then city funds could go into either a higher fund balance, or they could meet the criteria for a contribution to the budget stabilization reserve fund. And then secondly, I think what you alluded to, Councilman, about the contribution to the school district, because if the state gives more funding to the school district, because the city has made a commitment and they have increased funding over the last 3 to 4 years to the school district since it's been in local control, then maybe either the city still can contribute, and it would go to needed services at the school district, or they can withhold some of that money and then put it into a fund balance or a rainy day fund, or put that money to other city services such as recreation centers, job training, after school programs, rent assistance.
So I don't know, Mr. Chairman, and I guess our finance department will probably have greater information if those kinds of discussions, negotiations, requests are being made of the state in a way that can be helpful and actually stabilize our budget, not just this year, but for a couple of years to come. With $5 billion in surplus, we can give them some ideas on how to spend it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councilmember Jones. Very good point. Thank you for bringing that up. I do have another question, Mr. Rice, for you, and that is, it looks to me like the wage taxes are the biggest problem we're having in the lower revenue. It's about 118 million short.
Yes.
And then I think you outlined that it was, I think, parking and amusement, or maybe I missed something, but I think that was the order.
Right.
But parking and amusement, if I recall from memory, was like 25 and 18 million short, but the wage was 118 million.
Right. I think see that a little lower because I think the refunds are lower than what the city projected the refunds would be. So I don't know what that number is yet. We will know that when we see the final for FY21. But also, if you look at the revenues through August, there is some good news. You can see that the parking tax, the amusement tax, the city sales tax, they are all increasing. So that shows that the city is slowly getting back from the pandemic, especially if you compare them to last year at this time.
I mean, I think you're going to see the parking tax pick up dramatically because anybody coming into the city right now, it probably wants to drive in their car versus unfortunately taking SEPTA. So we have to figure out how we get SEPTA back up and running.
Absolutely. We see that with our own staff here.
Let me ask you this question. Back in, I think, March, it was, Pew did a report that showed that, and I think you're all familiar with this report, it showed our volatile tax structure report, basically, and it showed our budget shortfall for 2021, and it showed the projection that Detroit was the worst city in the country at 17% budget shortfall, and Philadelphia was the second worst at 14.7%. And what we're talking about today is how to like Band-Aid, patch, and get through this next few years. And my question to you is, this chart said from Pew that our reliance on wage tax revenue was our major issue here. In the long run, 5-10 years from now, how do we fix this problem? So there'll be another pandemic, another problem, there'll be another crisis. We all know that. But how do we fix the problem from a city perspective so we can deal with the next crisis in a better way?
Well, I think two ways. One is, and I think the city is the city administration is preparing this, is that they're going to look at the whole city tax structure, and I think they need to do that. Start doing that now, especially, and then so they can get it underway once this pandemic ends, and we're at some sort of a stable with each tax revenue, and then I think the second area is they need to prepare for such events such as this. They need to look at the Budget Stabilization Reserve Fund and why in 10 years was there only one contribution made of a little over $34 million. So there are two areas. I think the city is looking at the first area and talking with budget that they do want to look at the tax revenue structure. They might have to adjust it because of the pandemic and the way I hate to say a new normalcy will be for employer employees. And also, but I think I would urge the city's administration and council to look at the Budget Stabilization Reserve Fund and see what could be done to increase contributions to that over the future years.
Okay, thank you. Is it possible for PICA to send to us recommendations over the next 5-10 years of what they'd like to see happen in order to avoid the position we're in now going forward? Specific recommendations.
Sure. We will look into that, Councilman, and get something to you.
Okay, thank you. I think my colleague, Councilmember Sanchez, has a question. Councilmember Sanchez?
Good morning. Thank you, Council Member, and thank you, Harvey. Back in the spring, I think my office had forwarded off a letter. We were having a conversation about the fact that because of the pandemic and the recovery, there was a cost of government doing business and how that had changed. And I asked specifically of PICA, as I did for City Controller Rebecca Reinhardt, what, if anything, PICA could do to compare what were some of our fixed costs and how it related to other cities, because I think one of our challenges in the savings component is, what is the cost of doing business? It's changed under COVID, and what does that all mean, and how do we align with other cities in our expenditure and our ability to deliver some general services, right? There's a capital component, there's an operational component. We see it on trash and others. Have you guys looked at that at all? And what would you suggest? And how do you suggest?
I recall you mentioning that, Councilwoman, but we never received a letter, and we would need to know exactly.
I sent the letter over. I'll forward it again because it was.
Could you? And then, we will review that letter. Any questions we have, we'll contact you and your staff so we can get a definitive structure of what you want us to look at, and then we can do that. I just want to make sure that I'm looking at exactly what you want us to look at.
Okay, we'll do. I think it's an important context around the reality of how we're operating, right? We all want to save money. Nobody wants to save more money than Rob. He'd stash it all away if he could. But I think there's some realities that we need to come to terms with, some which are short-term, others require us to build in more efficiencies, right? But that's going to be the reality for the next 18 months, and we should be aware of them. Thank you so very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Sanchez. I think, are there any other questions for Mr. Rice? Okay, thank you, Mr. Rice. Thanks for your testimony. And I think thank you. Our Finance Director, Rob DeVoe, and our Budget Director, Marissa Waxman.
Thank you. And good morning, Council Member Dom and members of the Council Committee on Fiscal Stability. As I said, I'm Rob DeVoe, and I'm here with Marissa Waxman, the Budget Director, to testify on Resolution 200406. Thank you for giving us this opportunity. We have a short PowerPoint that we'll go through. Some of it goes over the same ground that Harvey went over, so we won't repeat the numbers, but we will go through it really quickly. One thing we wanted to emphasize, and at the end we'll give more detail on this, is the numbers that were in the quarterly report aren't the final numbers for FY21. Those come out at the end of May. Those are preliminary actuals that come out at the end of, did I say May? The end of October in our annual financial report. And then those are audited and the final numbers come out in February. So you'll see different numbers when those come out, and we will talk later about how they might change. And then we also have to do an updated 5-year plan because of our collective bargaining agreements. And so you'll see some numbers in there. I think most of the rest of the numbers on this page, on page 2, Harvey had gone through. I'm going to give some context that obviously, one of the reasons that revenues are down $200 million from FY20 is the pandemic. That changed our revenue structure dramatically. It also changed how we spend money, and it required us to reduce that spending. So that's down about $117 million from FY20. Those numbers resulted in a fund balance that is much lower than where it had been at the start of the pandemic. And on the next graph, we'll go through exactly what that looks like, and much lower than where we would want it to be. So as you can see, in FY19, our fund balance was about $439 million. So actually even a little higher than our 6 to 8% goal, which would have been at 382 million, but still well below where the GFOA recommendation is at 17%. And we realize, that as a city and a county, we have a different set of needs from a lot of cities. As a city, with a high poverty level, we also have a different revenue structure, and that also means we have a different set of needs. So we don't think that we're ever going to get to the 17%, but we do think getting to slightly lower number, that range between 6 and 8%, is what our goal should be. With that, I'm going to flip it over to Marissa to walk you through the next few slides.
Sure, thank you. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about the revenues and how they came in FY21. Again, as Rob mentioned, we will be updating these, and we'll talk in the end about the 60-day accrual and what that means. But basically, our revenues came in about 210 less than the prior year, but they were a little bit more than the target budget. So we had adjusted those upwards a bit. And as Harvey mentioned, that's really driven by a few things. One, that we started to draw down funds from the American Rescue Plan is based in there. And then also this is updated based on actual experience. We had some taxes that performed a bit better, and particularly the sales tax performed a bit better than we expected. We did talk a bit about, the wage tax is still really weak compared to where we once were. As Harvey mentioned, part of that the picture may look a little rosier because as we were projecting and estimating how many refunds commuters who didn't have to pay because they weren't coming in requested, that's a little lower than we thought. By the same token, at this point, we are still waiting with bated breath to see what it means that our universities have come back in terms of faculty and staff. And so we sort of lagged the rest of the country because we are so concentrated in meds and eds. And as the eds don't come back until basically this month, we're not seeing the same sort of growth that other cities may have saw starting in the summer, but we did start to see recovery based on some of the hospitality industry. And so just to break this down, our tax is a little bit better, as I said, really driven by the sales tax. Locally generated non-tax revenues a little worse than we had projected, and really a mixed bag there. Things were actually looking pretty good from our business-driven things, permits, licenses, but we fell short, particularly around our revenues related to the Philadelphia nursing home, where the census is significantly lower than it has been historically, as well as some delays in asset sales. Some properties we thought we would sell in FY21, those deals are taking longer, and we expect them in FY22 or later. So that's more a delay as opposed to a permanent loss related to those. Not much variation in terms of when our sort of early spring March projections were, and for at the end of the fourth quarter for some of our other accounts. In terms of the spending, again, this will adjust a bit as we figure out grant funds and adjustments there. But in general, we wound up spending a bit less than we expected than our earlier projection. In large part, that's because part of the new normal funds for city council, those programs sort of were not able to be stood up at the end of 21. We did roll those forward so that those programs can start in FY22. So that was about $11 million. So that's why the spending's about $10 million less than we thought. That said, partway through the year, our initial projections for spending for FY21, those got increased, and you guys may recall the mid-year transfer ordinances doing that. A couple of things that had driven that. One was the decision to maintain fire service at the current pre-pandemic level. That required an additional $24 million. The additional $10 million that went in to make sure we could do the presidential election, as well as there was $8 million because trash tonnage increased, so the waste disposal costs went up, and so those were some of the big drivers. Also, we put into place a $50 million COVID expense fund, and that was a reserve so that if federal, state, whatever dollars didn't show up for COVID costs, we wouldn't have to go without, doing what we needed to do in terms of testing, vaccination, but we had our own reserve. Some good news is that a lot of FEMA dollars have come through, so we'll be updating and actually probably won't need to spend that $50 million of general fund dollars that we'd set aside for COVID. And the last panel, we talked a bit about the interplay between staffing levels, overtime, and leave usage. And so as Harvey mentioned, generally overtime is actually down, but again, that reflects a mixed bag. We had some departments that weren't operating at all or at significantly reduced levels, so they didn't need the overtime they would typically use in a year. But then obviously we have a number of public health, public safety departments where the strain was even greater in the pandemic. But on balance, it led to a bit less. And so part of this, again, is the leave usage, because, when you're thinking about if we want to provide a certain service level, you need a certain number of staff to do that. And if you don't have the number of full-time positions, and if you don't have folks who are there because they are out for health reasons or other reasons, then that's when you lean to the overtime. And so leave usage is part of this picture. If the staff you have on the books isn't there on a particular day, then they can't do that work. And in certain departments, you can't wait. You can't do it the next day, obviously overtime comes in. And so there are areas where we're seeing ongoing concerns with the leave usage, streets, sanitation, the sheriff, prisons, some of that driven by COVID-19, some of it driven by non-COVID factors, and continuing to work through those. And really the overtime and the leave usage plugs into what I'm showing here, which is the number of filled positions. During FY21, we put a hiring freeze into place because we knew that we may still have to save some costs. And so for the most part, and sometimes I talk about it as a hiring cold snap, because what we did was we evaluated requests for filling positions, backfilling positions, typically approving those related to public health and public safety, but ones where we could wait. And where that leaves us is in the general fund, or actually across all funds, about 3,400 positions less than we had budgeted for are filled. And so, that's about 10%. That's where, we've got 90% of the people resources that we would need to do the jobs we had planned to do. So all of this obviously is also impacting performance measures, how many folks we have available to do the work, and then everything related to COVID. So about 60% of our performance measures were still on track, about 40% were not. And again, different things were able to happen. CLIP managed to do more citywide cleanup projects than normal, than they had projected. The Free Library had more digital visits than they had initially projected. But in some areas, things were falling short. The Free Libraries, not surprisingly, had far less in-person visits than they initially thought they would have, as COVID caused us to reduce the number of hours that the libraries were open. Other variations, not so much COVID related, but licenses and inspections. They have a set budget for doing demolitions, and then they have a target for the number of demolitions they'll complete. In the past year, though, they had several large commercial demolitions. Those are much more expensive. So if you have a couple of really expensive ones, it means the total volume you can do is reduced. And so that's pretty much how things were turning out in FY21. Wanted to turn a little bit about how things have been going in terms of spending through the first 2 months of FY22. 2 months is 16.7% of the year. And if we had no seasonal variation, you'd say, well, we should have spent 16.7% of our money so far. But as Harvey mentioned, there's a lot of departments that either spend stuff early in the year or encumber it, which we consider spent. For example, City Council encumbers all of the funds for 12 months worth of court reporters in July. So it looks like you've spent all that money, but you've just encumbered it. And as Harvey mentioned, there's some other big ones. The Commerce Department pays the Convention Center subsidy, which is $15 million. A lot of our debt service is paid early in the year. So it's not surprising that we're a little ahead of that 16.7%. But what is really important to see is we're not ahead in Class 100. That one, despite, other than some seasonal variations, is where we'd get concerned if we were well ahead, that there'd be a hard time toggling back without layoffs or something dramatic. And so what you can see here is this is the spending across all categories. And as I mentioned, you see Commerce spiked high. They've already paid the Convention Center subsidy. DBH IDS, they encumber a significant amount of the dollars that go to their providers early in the year. Similar conversation, as I mentioned, sinking fund, that's where the debt service is. So this up and above. Where I would be worried is if on this slide, which just looks at payroll costs, if this were running ahead of where we should be 2 months in. And so by looking at Class 100, our salaries in isolation, this lets us know, okay, we are still within budget, we are on track. Obviously, things can throw us off, particularly in those public safety, public health areas where if something happens, overtime might be needed. But generally, this shows that we're doing pretty well so far. So this is where we are 2 months into the fiscal year. But as we mentioned, and Rob started by saying, we're still finalizing the books for 21, and that's going to let us know exactly how much cushion and room we have for the rest of this year. There's going to be a number of different drivers that change the numbers we presented today, the preliminary ones, before the next time we present numbers in late October in that annual financial report. First of all, the revenues are going to reflect the collections from 60-day accruals. Basically, anything that we get during July and August that should have been paid in June, we get to count towards last year, so we do. We'll also get updated information about tax credits and how those are being utilized. And with the BERT tax, those can swing millions and millions of dollars. We'll also be finishing up figuring out how we are transferring funds between our departments. How much does the general fund have to pay the water department for its water bills? This year it's actually likely going to be less because with fewer pools open, we filled less pools. That actually has a material impact on our water bill. We'll also be looking to see how much grant dollars we can use to cover expenses. I mentioned that we had set aside and been charging against a $50 million COVID reserve that was housed in the MDO budget. But we are really chugging to get other folks to pay for that. And so we continue to try and make sure that we get grant dollars to cover as much as possible. And then we'll also be looking at what just wound up being underspent. And I already mentioned the new normal. There's other things where projects just sometimes towards the end of the year don't get off the ground, or there's other delays. And so we'll be seeing where those are. So all of those are what's going to influence about a month from now, the next set of numbers you see, and why there'll be variation from the ones we present today about the fourth quarter of FY21. So that's where we are. And obviously we are happy to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you, Marissa, and thank you, Rob. I have a few questions for you. Let me start by just asking the question. It seems like you're up about 3,400 employees in the city overall. And I know there's overtime to make up for their lost shifts, but do you have any kind of idea what you think that savings might be in the budget?
So that's something that we are working on now, and we'll get it netted out. So there'll be some increased overtime costs in some areas, but also some, underspends in terms of flat salaries. But a lot of the larger departments where it's fairly normal to have vacancies, that's actually already built into their budget. So we have something that we always build in or typically build in particularly larger budgets called a vacancy allowance. So it's already often built into our assumptions that not 100% of positions are filled 100% of the year. But in the next month, we'll tighten up where the pluses and minuses are overall.
And just in general, if we pay $1 in labor, I know I've asked this question over the years. I know it's different for different departments, but what is the actual total cost for every dollar of labor we pay for an employee?
It's not only different by department, it's different by employee, depending on what pension plan they're in, what kind of other equipment they need. So, it can be anywhere from 40% to over 100%, depending on all those factors. So it really varies.
And is the overtime typically time and a half would be, 50 cents on the dollar?
I would say typically, but there are some variables depending upon, is it overtime on a Sunday that's also a holiday? It can get more, or so there are variations, but generally, yes, it's time and a half.
So you'll let us know about that analysis when you have it ready. And then the other question, I know that recently there were some contract negotiations or contract agreements that were signed for Class 100 budget for fiscal year 22. How does that impact to the labor reserve we budgeted, and how will it impact our department budgets, if at all?
Yeah, so when we enter into collective bargaining agreements, we have to submit a new plan to PICA. So what you'll see some point in the next month is a new 5-year plan that will build in all the changes that we have to make as a result of those contracts. And so we're going through that process now. It will definitely have an impact really throughout the budget and throughout the 5-year plan. We're in the process of developing that.
So we don't know the actual impact yet?
We know the cost per contract for the 3 years of those contracts, and I can give you that in a second.
Was the cost what you projected or different?
So the cost is higher than what was in the labor reserve. So we'll have to figure out kind of how to make up that difference. I think the total cost over the 3 years of the 3 contracts is in the $330 million range. And as you know, we had $200 million over 5 years. So there's a gap there.
It's 130 million or so over 5 years?
Well, that 330 is a 3-year cost, and we had 200 million over 5 years. So it's slightly larger than that.
Yeah. That sounds like a big potential deficit for us.
Yeah, so that's what we're figuring out as we redo the 5-year plan.
Okay. Next question, I don't know if it's possible, but I look at fiscal stability, and I know we're talking about the reserve funds and our budgets, but we also have assets. Is there? I haven't seen it, but maybe you have it. Is there some sort of like financial statement, balance sheet for the city of Philadelphia that we could look at as council that shows, for example, this is what our pension should be funded at this level. This is what we have in there. Our liquid assets are this. This is where our budget stands. This is where our other assets are, and what their values are net of debt.
So, yeah, the annual comprehensive financial report has that information.
And so if I asked you this simple question today, Rob, and said, look, because individuals, when they go for loans, they'll say it's not just their cash, it's their financial assets, right? What is the city's financial value as we stand here today?
Yeah, I can get you that. It's in the act, I'm just not looking at it right now, but that's...
I mean, I'm talking about counting the real estate assets less the debt.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, I'll look forward to that one. And I think Councilmember Jones has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. By way of a recovery, my concern is use and occupancy. And as companies that have large labor pools have discovered that they can survive and work from home, how is that dealing with our occupancy of commercial assets, office buildings, and to a degree, restaurants that can't find staffers and therefore aren't at full occupancy? How is that being factored?
So that for the city, that would affect our property tax. For the school district, it would hit the use and occupancy tax. So, it's part of when we put together our projections. It's one of the things that we talked about with outside economists where they thought markets would go. And so we built it in that way. Marissa may have some more details on specifically how it was built. That's the general approach.
Yeah, we work with IHS, our outside economists, to understand each of our tax types and what the various drivers are. And so we've toggled those into our growth rates. Some of them are driven by sort of regional economic activity, because if the region's doing well and suburbanites want to come in and have dinner, that's one thing. There's other things that really are just, city county borders, and that's what's going to influence. We are, however, meeting with them actually next week to see if they have any updated thoughts, because a couple different things going on. The end of the unemployment benefits, we want to try and understand whether or not that's going to be affecting the labor market. There are some sort of natural experiments from the states that didn't accept those extended benefits, and trying to understand what that's going to do to labor availability and whether or not that's going to have an impact. A lot of what you're saying, the restaurants not finding staff. So can we expect a shift there? But obviously, do we also need to update based on the Delta variant? And I also mentioned that some of our lag compared to other jurisdictions is that our economic reopening, while we sort of lifted the last of our restrictions in June, so much is driven by activity on our university campuses that we're not going to necessarily see what that bounce back looks like until we get into right where we are now. So, we're in an interesting time to incorporate all of that into what do we think it means in terms of the occupancy and commercial real estate and what folks are doing. Some of that's an even longer time horizon as leases are coming up to be renewed. There's folks who are locked into a lease for another 2 years. That's when they're going to make the decision about, do we need the same square footage? Do we need a different type of space? So unfortunately, there's no point at which we're going to have all of the answers. We have to sort of be comfortable living in the questions for a bit. And so that's a lot of what we're looking at and constantly updating.
So are you working with commercial realtors and Chamber of Commerce types that say, hypothetically, Blue Cross, here they used to have 10,000 square feet in this building, and now looking at operating half that. And when that lease comes up, they're not going to renew it for that amount and might only, instead of cubicles, let's go with meeting space when needed, where necessary, shared. So are we kind of looking to that to then say, can this building be converted into residential? I mean, are we looking at those kinds of trends?
So I think, definitely on the economic projection side, we're definitely trying to keep our ear to the ground on what's happening in commercial real estate, what's happening in transactions, because that drives our realty transfer tax. And I think that that's going to be what you're suggesting is the really interesting question that'll be sort of budget moving into planning and development, thinking about zoning, and commerce, thinking about what do we want to do. I think that's going to raise some really interesting questions, not just for us, but how do folks use space. I was talking to a consultant that specializes in tech industry in big cities, and also high commercial office buildings, and just how there may be a segregation between where outside folks are allowed in versus areas of spaces that only the badge staff can get into, and that being a lot more segregated. And so it may be the same amount of space but really different configurations. I think there's a lot of good questions there, but I can say even my staff, people have not yet decided, are they coming back to the municipal service building or not? And that's the decisions that are just thousands and thousands of individual decisions are going to then lead to what does the shift in the real estate market look like, and then as a result, what do we want to shift with in terms of our planning and zoning and things like that. So it's going to evolve, but those are the right questions to be looking at.
And it has a rippling effect, because if I run the luncheonette or the shoe repair shop that's adjacent to the big office building, then maybe I don't need to be there anymore. And we need to kind of look at where that's going, but how do we adjust? And if nothing more than our finances, but we really need to take a look at where things are going. If I'm a company and I work 25% more efficient with 50% less cost because I don't have a physical office, how do I entice that company to revisit the real estate usage? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councilmember Jones. You raise a very, very important issue. And I'll just share with you what I've been seeing, and I have a few more questions, but I'm seeing people in the commercial market not really knowing what's going to happen. And most of them, when their leases are coming up, are taking one-year extensions and waiting to see what happens. When will the city reopen? When will these offices open up? Is it going to be November 1st? Is it January 1st? We had that temporary setback with the variant. So I think they don't really know. But I do think we need to be prepared on all fronts, and you bring up some excellent points. And I think that we need to focus in two areas, big time: life sciences and tech. Those are the growth industries for Philadelphia, life sciences and tech. When I say life sciences, I'm talking about cell therapy and what goes on out at University of Penn. Seeing that lease get signed out in King of Prussia was like putting a knife in our heart. That's not what we want to see. We want to keep them here, because when you have life sciences and you have cell therapy, other companies want to join them, and they'll come here because they want to be around them for that connectivity. So
to your point, Mr. Chairman, Bud Biotech up at the old Bud plant, they're reinvesting in that and repurposing those buildings to focus on biotech firms that want and seek this region because of the eds and meds, because of the lifestyle that they can have in Philadelphia. So we need to kind of move away from certain industries. I don't know if we'll ever get the call center back, where they're calling and dialing for dollars, but we may get the biotech firms that are hands-on in producing product and kind of sharpen our telescopes to try to land those kind of deals.
Our goal, and we've talked about this, Councilman Jones, is going to be, how do we get our Philadelphia residents those jobs and trained in those fields so they can get those good paying jobs? We need those good paying jobs. And a lot of it is our tax structure that's prevented us from doing that. I know we're working on that now. I have another question, maybe it's for Rob. When we're searching for money in government or in business, you look at every corner and every crevice. So I want to talk about delinquencies for a minute. Right now, I think, and I will say this, I believe the Revenue Department under current chairperson Frank Breslin is doing a great job. Commissioner is doing a great job. And we have about $309 million in principal of delinquent taxes across the board. Half of it roughly is in real estate taxes. And the other two big pieces are it's 146 million in real estate, 42 million in wage, and 66 million in BERT taxes. There's three taxes that maybe we could take a little extra focus on to figure out, is there more money there that we could collect to help close some of these gaps that we're experiencing? So I don't know if you want to address that.
Yeah, I think revenue is sharply focused on all three of those. The last year and a half has obviously been hard. We scaled back on enforcement for obvious reasons. We're gradually starting kind of to go back to enforcement, but we have to be mindful of how we do that, and the kind of the situation people are in. That said, the property tax collection percent has remained really high. We think we're probably it's still at 96%, which, given everything that happened, I think is really amazing. But it's obviously something that we'll continue to look at, and as the economy opens back up, put more focus on it.
Yeah, let me just say, Revenue Commissioner and you, Rob and Marissa, and the whole Finance Department, we owe a debt of gratitude, because I remember 6 years ago it was like at 90%. So to go from that level to 96 and maintain it at 96 in today's environment is great. Of course, I'd like to see it to get 98, but 96 is really good. So
yeah, no, Frank and his folks have done an amazing job. They've been great.
Yeah, excellent. I'd like to recognize my colleague, Councilmember Kathy Gilmore Richardson, for the question.
Thank you. And thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and to all of you for all of your work and for the information that has been provided thus far. I've been listening, and I apologize. I've had tech delays with the chat feature this morning. But I wanted to ask a quick question, and I apologize if I missed this, but how many requests have you all received thus far from individuals who work in the city and may not reside in the city seeking wage tax refunds? And how much?
So I can tell you the number I know off the top of my head in terms of dollars is in the mid $90 million range. That's from sort of the start of that opening up to earlier this month. And so some of that will be attributable to FY21, some will be attributable to FY22. But one, that's only part of the story. There's the people who had that wage tax withheld and then need to come to us now for a refund, and that's that 90 million. What's harder to disaggregate, and I'll be honest, I don't know if we will ever be able to, it's going to be fodder for PhD students for decades, is where some of our larger employers very early in the pandemic stopped withholding. So there's no need to ask us for a refund. So those are the two pieces about how the change for commuters who are working from home, and keeping in mind that that's only allowed when it is directed by the employer, not so if the office is closed, they can't come in, great, it's no money due to us. It's going to be interesting as we move forward when it becomes more of a choice of the employee. And we can get you the number. I want to say it's in the like 30,000 range. Rob, did you get it?
Yeah, it's about 35,000, roughly 35,000 so far.
Okay, 35,000 so far.
Yeah. That was early this month. That was as of September 8th.
Okay. So as of September 8th. And so how are you all factoring that into how you're looking at the budget moving forward, and some of the work that you'll do to modify the budget based on the revenue actuals? How are you modifying that moving forward?
So what we are doing within the next month is we tighten up the FY21. We're going to update we had initially thought we'd have about $120 million worth of those refund requests in the late spring. We had dialed that back to 105. It looks like now we'll probably dial that back to about 90. The trick here is that folks do have 3 years to request those refunds. And so there's still some risk. It's not like we can say, boom, 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 $95 million and we're done. there's still some exposure that maybe the rest of those requests just come in later. We had built into our 5-year plan a reduced level for FY22, so about $70 million worth of refunds. And then going at basically what we had done working with the city's economist was an assumption that about 15% of those commuter wage tax dollars never come back. And obviously that's a mix of folks, some folks never setting foot in the city to work at all again, as well as some folks working a couple of days a week. But overall, 15% of those commuter wage tax dollars we think are permanently gone.
Okay, but to that point, and to the point of Councilmember Jones talking about all of our commercial real estate and office space and, the conversations you stated you've been having with individuals in that sector, do you think that 15% number is realistic, depending on the other revenues for some of the secondary businesses around office buildings, or do you think that projection should be changed as well?
So that was the projection that we made with our economists when we made it in May. We'll continue updating, but obviously, as we've been talking about, people have not yet settled on what they're going to be doing 3 years from now. So we continue to regularly refine. We, get monthly reports from our economists. We update our revenue projections usually about twice a year, and so it's something that we will. Because it has such a material impact on the budget, we're obviously going to continue to update. And we use a lot of really interesting data sources. One of the ones that I find most interesting that our economists look at is the number of building security card swipes in like downtown commercial office buildings. And how many of those we have compared to pre-pandemic. And that doesn't give you the exact split of residents versus non-residents, but it lets you sort of see how things are going. We were inching back up, and we still are, we've got more folks coming in than San Francisco or New York, but we're well below Dallas and I think Chicago. So, there's different trends in different cities, and that's a lot of what we're looking at. And again, for us, since we're so heavily concentrated though in meds and eds, a good chunk of this is we're gonna know a lot more once we see how the universities, the staff, the faculty, how that plays out, and that's probably gonna really influence what we see going forward. And obviously, as we move through this year in Delta variant, does everything stay open, or do you see shutdowns again?
Sure. And so again, to your point, though, I'm just curious on how you all are looking at or analyzing any secondary tax collection information for businesses that are sort of around the eds and meds or around the center city downtown area as an indication of that percentage, the 15% of folks not coming back.
So there's going to be a lot of different things that we look at, and particularly geographically is what's interesting. So some of those taxes are parking tax. We see that, and there's a lot of different things. Our parking tax comes in sort of 3 big areas: University City, which definitely real heavy meds and eds, and we'll see that's the one we think will change. Huge amount comes from the airport. And so, that's, on the one hand, it looks like there's changes in what's allowable for international travel, but really how long until business travel, does it come back? Does it ever come back? And then layer that on top of, trends around car sharing services and, how folks use those to get to the airport. So we do look at also, say, our use and occupancy tax. We break down by neighborhood, our realty transfer tax. So we do get to see different windows into what that means. Like one of the questions that were things we've been talking about is, yes, maybe if there's reduced demand for the lunch counter in Center City, are things changing commercial corridors when folks are, up in the Northwest and working from home? And, are they running errands that they used to do, downtown at the Macy's? Are they doing that in the neighborhood? Or, and so how much is going to be a geographic reshuffling versus, just an overall decline or increase? So a lot of open questions. We're looking at all of that. I don't think we have definitive answers on anything really yet.
Okay, thank you. And thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Council Member. Thank you. These statistics I'll just share as I'm listening. I think in the core of the city right now, the traffic flow, pedestrian count from 2019 is down about 35%. And I also think that the office worker market right now is between 30 and 40% occupied. So we need to figure out a way to have the employers, the top 25 or 50 employers, we should like speak to them, tell them, get their vaccinations done and bring their people back to work. I am hearing more and more people do want to come back to work. And it's probably also good for people's marriages for them to come back to work. I just mentioned that. Not that I'm married, I'm just saying that's what I hear. So last question for you, Rob and Marissa. I know we had spent, or we invested, I should say, $155 million this year on the violence prevention budget. And we're very committed to that. And that's our number one issue, I believe. And we're trying to figure out the roadmap regarding a plan for this, set of goals, and how we're going to evaluate and monitor the investments we're making so we know what's making a difference, what's working, what isn't, so we can shift quickly and put the money into those programs that are working. I think in the budget, it was about, 1.7 million was set aside for evaluation. So how are we going to go about evaluating it and using that money?
So I'll be honest, I don't have all the details at the tip of my tongue, but managing director's office was standing up mechanisms to do. Some of that is bringing in consultants and evaluators. Some we have resources within city government. The GovLab PHL, which sits within the mayor's office, often sets up sort of programmatic approaches to evaluation. And so both of those will, I believe, be built in some of our internal reviews, which we always do, but also outside evaluators, third parties, like sometimes happens with larger grant programs, but we can get back to you with additional information about how that's going to be structured.
Okay, yeah, I think it's very important that we monitor that very closely. We have a committee from council looking at it. I hope they get all the information they need in order to do that. But that's a big investment, and we want to make sure that we're being productive with that investment and making a difference. So, thank you. All right, I think I want to thank all the witnesses from this first panel. Thank you for being here today. Thank you for your testimony, and really appreciate all your efforts and very informative. So I'd like to ask the clerk to call the next panel.
Our second panel today is Christine Coulter, Adam Teal, Christopher Newman, Ralph DiPietro, and for the Department of Prisons, we have Deputy Commissioner Beaufort.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to ask if the first panel wants to stay on, that'd be great. We may have some additional questions if you can. So let's start with our Deputy Police Commissioner, Christine Coulter. Good morning, and thank you for being here.
Good morning, Councilman Dom and members of council. I'm Christine Coulter, the Deputy of Organizational Services in the Police Department. I'm here today to testify on Resolution 200-406, which calls for a hearing to discuss the fiscal position and overarching social impact goals of the city, included and related in the 5-year plan and the reporting requirements set forth in the quarterly city manager's report. The quarterly manager's report for the fourth quarter, which is ended 6/30/21, shows that the projected PPD spending is $727 million, which is the same amount that was budgeted and is unchanged from the projection last quarter. Thank you for allowing me to be here today, and I'm happy to answer any questions at this time.
Thank you. I do have a couple of questions for you. What changes has the department made to try to align with the city's violence prevention programs?
The department is very much part of the roadmap and working with the city in the areas that the police are responsible for changing. So whether it's adding pinpoint locations or working on different community events and working with our community partners, I believe that we're lockstep with the plans as we move forward. Commissioner Outlaw, along with Vanessa, chair that panel, and everything that is discussed and we bring forward comes back to both and all of our external partners as well.
Okay, thank you. I just want to recognize Councilmember Jim, who's joined. Good morning, Councilmember Jim. And so the next question is, percent vaccinated on the police force, what is our percentage right now?
The best guess I could give you, because we don't have a mandate to report, obviously in individual units, we have people operating under the city guidelines, which means they must be double masked if they're not vaccinated when in public space. But I believe we're about 80% based on what was done through LEHB, as well as those that we knew were done by the Black Doctors Consortium and some of the other counties surrounding Philadelphia when we did not have it available yet. Some folks that were eligible in other counties received it there. So it's encouraging that talking with our partners at LEHB, every day a few more employees call there and say, hey, I'm ready. Now obviously they're not dispatched, but they can tell them exactly where to go same day before, anybody changes their mind. So I think our numbers are going to continue to rise. And as we move forward, in accordance with the city policy, all of our new hires will be vaccinated. So that will only bring our percentage up.
Okay, thank you. And question on your budget. It looks like your fiscal year 21 adopted budget and target budget didn't change at all between the adoption in June 2020 and the end of the fiscal year in June 2021. When is the last time that happened? The numbers were identical. And how is that made possible?
If you don't mind, I'm going to kick it to Scott Cadden because he's been doing the budget a lot longer than I've been here, since it's obviously an open-ended, going back to the past question.
Can you repeat the question, Dom?
Yes, sure. It looks like your fiscal year 21 adopted budget and target budget didn't change at all between the adoption in June 2020 and the end of the fiscal year in June 2021. My questions are, when's the last time that happened? What made that possible? And also, how should council interpret that? And does it mean that there weren't any unexpected costs this year? It was right to the penny.
As far as class 100, we had overtime costs that increased, but the amount of our staffing was decreased because we didn't have no hires in 21. So that kind of balanced out. And as far as needs in the other classes, we did transfer money from 300 and 400 class to 200 class to take care of some needs there. So we were able to just balance out what was needed in the budget.
Okay.
Scott, can you remember if that's ever happened in the past that we came in that exact?
I don't believe it has. I think we've always got changes in the target budget.
And Scott, do you think you'll see any large adjustments from the Q4 in the annual financial report?
No, for like the actual numbers compared to I think we're going to be a little above what our budget was, the adopted budget. Just what came in, I think our abatements were a little lower than we anticipated.
Okay, thank you. And Commissioner Calder, I guess this last question is for you. I guess it's a department question. Would the department consider setting new performance goals? For instance, rather than say we have a goal of less than 400 homicides this year, do we think maybe reducing the levels by, we want 5%, 10%, 25% less, and over what time period? And then what would our aspirational goal be here? And then what's the plan to get us there? At least with something like this in place, like the council and the public would have a better sense of whether or not we're on track to achieving those goals. And I think it'd be more meaningful and manageable for everyone.
It's certainly worth considering, because I do understand that it's very easy, especially in a tumultuous year, to wind up already not at your goal. When you set a goal that you've already not reached and it's October, it's impossible to roll any of that back. So in many of our performance areas, we do utilize a 2% increase, 2% decrease, which makes it, I guess, easier to attain. It's not really a stretch goal. And sometimes we become victims of really wanting it to happen, because at the end, our goal would be eventually to reduce it to zero. That's not realistic. So we have to make sure that what we put in, but we could certainly discuss it with our executive team to look at a different way to present our goals, still looking towards that same eye of reducing, but maybe not locking into a number, but just showing that slow, steady progress. Because as we look at not only our city, but every other city, you hate to gain success that by other cities are up 40% and we're up 18, because in the end, there's still people who were murdered and there's still families that lost that person. So to find, I guess, the way to not be disingenuous, because if you come to 395, it's still not a success. Even though we met our goal, there's still, terrible violence that's been perpetrated against people. But, you know, I'll certainly bring it back to Commissioner Outlaw, and we will sit down and talk about maybe a better way of making some goal that's easily to digest by the public and still something that we can keep working towards.
And I think if you do set that kind of goal, and you know, one homicide is too many, but if you do set that kind of goal, at least if we have the ability to manage it and track it, and monitor it, look at it constantly, you'll be more likely to achieve it than if we do not do that. You know, there was a Harvard study done many years ago that said when you set a goal and you write it down, you have a higher chance of achieving it, like 50%, versus if you don't. And if you look at it monthly, it increases another 50%. And if you look at it weekly, another 50. And if you carry it around in your pocket written and you look at it daily, you're likely to achieve it. So,
Councilman, I agree. And there's something I can assure you when it comes to murders and shooting violence, we look at it daily. We don't wait for a week or a month. But years back, we did crime plans in the department. And I gave every officer in my command in West Philly a copy of that plan. And they were required to have it in their pocket. So nobody could say, I wasn't sure that's what we were trying to do. So I agree that if it's something you have to change your shirt every day, you change it, you look at it. And I believe that study is probably accurate. But honestly, there's not a morning that we don't talk about gun violence deployment strategies, because it's obviously very important to us, but even more important to those who are impacted by it daily.
okay, thank you very much. Are there any questions for the Deputy Police Commissioner? Seeing none, thank you very much for your testimony today. I'd like to ask our Fire Commissioner, Adam Thiel. Good morning, Commissioner Thiel.
Good morning, Councilmember Dom and members of City Council. My name is Adam Thiel, and I am the Commissioner for the Philadelphia Fire Department and the Office of Emergency Management Director. I am here today to testify on Resolution Number 200406, which calls for hearings to discuss the fiscal position and overarching social impact goals of the city, including and as related to the 5-year plan and the reporting requirements set forth in the quarterly City Manager's Report and as submitted to the Pennsylvania Intergovernmental Cooperation Authority. The quarterly City Manager's Report for the fourth quarter of FY21, which ended on 6/30/21, shows the projected PFD spend is $339 million, the same level projected last quarter. Thank you, and I am happy to answer any questions you have at this time.
Thank you, Commissioner. I guess I have a few quick questions. Should we anticipate any additional appropriation requests this fiscal year?
Councilmember, I think at this point in time, it would be hard for me to answer that just a couple months into the fiscal year, given the fact that we are working several concurrent disasters.
Okay. And I know that right now you're not at the desired number of full-time employees. But, how short are we at in the fire department right now?
We are about 600 filled positions off our budgeted position count.
And what can we do to help you recruit more people in the fire department?
Councilmember, we're doing a lot of work on recruitment, and I do want to, I'm glad you said that. Actually, the deadline for firefighter EMTs is on October 1st. So if you're watching this out there, you know, and you're interested, please go to phila.gov/fire. You can find all the information. The challenge really for us, as we've talked about before, is it's a 9-month academy process, and it takes us about 2 academies a year to cover attrition and then start to get into that approximately 600 person gap that we have between our full position count, our full authorization, and where we are today. So it's really a matter of timing and throughput versus anything else.
And I know, Commissioner, I remember visiting a program in Councilman Jones's district. I think it's at Randolph High School for firefighters, and they get hired. They get hired right from school, or how does that work exactly?
No, sir. They still go through the civil service process in accordance with all of the city regulations for that. Although they do get some points for participating in that program, and there are some other ways to get points. We're also, as we've talked about before, we have our facility now at 7,800 Ogons fully operational. So we have about double the amount of explorers that we've had in the past. We were able to accommodate them in that facility. So we hope that's going to really help us for the future.
And Commissioner, just since we're doing some marketing today to get you more people in the fire department, what's the average starting salary for someone who might be interested?
Councilmember, I actually don't know the answer to that, and of course it'll be subject to the current negotiations in the contract. But all that information, when that's done, will be on that website at phila.gov/fire. I can say it's certainly a very reasonable wage, and of course, more importantly, it's the toughest job you'll ever love.
That's a good one. And percent vaccinated on your staff?
Councilmember, we don't know. We vaccinated approximately 50% of our staff in our own clinics, but that was months ago. Same issue you heard from PPD. Folks are still uploading their vaccination cards. I would hesitate to give an estimate at this point, but we know the number is higher than that 50% that we vaccinated on our own because people have been going out and getting vaccinated at other locations.
Okay. Any questions for Mr. Thiel?
Yes, Mr. Chair, this is Councilmember Gilmore Richardson.
Chair would like to recognize Councilmember Gilmore Richardson.
Thank you. I'm having trouble with the chat this morning. So at any rate, Commissioner, good morning. It's good to see you. And thank you again for your service. I'll just say no matter where I am in the country, you are highly regarded. And I was even at the Coast Guard Academy this weekend and met someone who said they had worked with you in the past. So I just wanted to again thank you for your service. I have one question just for the record. If you could detail your overtime costs so far for this fiscal year.
Councilmember, I don't have detail on that. We'd have to get back to you. You saw on the prior slides from PICA, we're under our spend from last year. It would be hard to project that, though, with the kind of unknown impact of COVID going forward, plus all the other disasters. And, of course, our core mission continues. Unfortunately, we've already had 25 fire deaths this year, 152 injuries, and more than 1,600 individuals displaced by home fires here in Philadelphia. So our core mission continues even as we deal with those other things, but we can get you those numbers unless one of the budget folks has that immediately at hand.
Sure. I mean, I know you all had, I think, a 17.1% reduction thus far. I just wanted you to sort of notate for the record some of the strategies you all are utilizing to sort of keep overtime costs low, knowing that we have a number of significant challenges that you all are facing, particularly as it relates to the staffing challenges.
Councilmember, I appreciate that. I frankly would not expect that to stay under, candidly, because most of our overtime, more than 80% of our overtime, goes to fill minimum staffing frontline service positions on fire engines, ladder trucks, ambulances, et cetera. So as long as we have that deficit in personnel from our authorized strength, and our authorized strength also includes, again, thanks to council and our colleagues at budget and others, that incorporates a relief factor, so we don't have to use overtime immediately if somebody is using their earned leave benefits or is otherwise off. Because we have not reached that level right now, if a frontline firefighter, EMT, medic, or dispatcher uses their earned leave benefit or becomes sick or something else happens, we have to use overtime to fill that position. We cannot operate a fire engine with any less than 4 people on board. So we're constantly using overtime to fill those positions. So I'm not sure I would expect that to stay under, although I'm hopeful. Of course, what really spiked it over the past year plus was the impact of COVID on our workforce. So I think what that is probably we're seeing less of an impact on the workforce every day. I'm certainly hopeful, but I don't know that I would expect that to continue.
Understood. I just wanted to quickly highlight, the deficit in personnel and versus the authorized strength that you all have in the fire department to talk about recruitment and retention strategies, but particularly around how we can work with schools like Randolph and others to create a pipeline for the fire department. Can you just talk about that work a little more so that, I think it's a real opportunity for us to continue to decrease overtime by recruiting and getting more young people into these positions. And I don't know that we're doing all that we can at this point to do that, even from a council perspective. So I just wanted to ask you about that.
Councilmember, I appreciate that. One quick follow-up from your prior question. It's important for folks to understand. We control when our employees are able to use their earned leave benefits. So by contrast to many other businesses or even some of our other agencies, if you want to take off tomorrow and there are already so many people who are scheduled to be off, we don't allow you to take vacation or take annual leave. So it is important. We do control. It's sort of slot limited if you're able to take off. So we do have some fairly robust controls. At the end of the day, as long as we're filling minimum staffing positions, that's the situation. We actually, so we don't have any lack of interest in the fire department. We already have thousands of applications through the door for this current process. So we really have no lack of interest in firefighter EMT positions. We're hopeful that will continue. We are still building our pipelines everywhere we can. That's one reason why we, again, with support from council and certainly the mayor's office, open the 7,800 Ogons facility so we can be recruiting right at street level in neighborhoods. We expect to be offering community EMT classes again. We piloted a couple of those classes, one in West Philly and one with the 1199C organization. So we expect to continue to do that. Our real shortages right now, the place where we're not seeing a lot of interest is for dispatchers. So this is another one, certainly, and I know our colleagues at PPD, we really want to encourage folks to think about that. So you can go to phila.gov and find the Officer Human Resources page and check out being a dispatcher, very rewarding career. The other place that we have real challenges is with paramedics, advanced life support providers. There is a national and a state shortage of advanced life support providers. So we're not alone, and also keeping in mind the challenge that we have the busiest ambulance in the entire nation is here in Philadelphia. It's not in New York, it's not in LA, it's not in Houston. And oh, by the way, we're the second busiest fire department overall of any city in the nation after New York. Not Houston, not LA. Even the cities that have populations that are greater than we are don't have the same workload that we have. So it is a challenge for us to recruit advanced life support providers, which is why a lot of our efforts are focused on EMT programs, community EMT programs, fire EMS at Randolph Skills Academy. We have an advanced EMT pipeline that we created with Civil Service Commission. So it's not as big of a jump from basic EMT to paramedic. So I think we're doing everything we can to address the shortfalls in those positions while we continue to make sure that we're getting as much out there as possible to have young people think about the fire department as a career, as well as the Office of Emergency Management. We just had our hurricane program. The first national offering of the hurricane program was right here in Philadelphia. So that's another area of our workforce where we're doing everything we can. That was really targeted at young women. And also want to remind everybody that firefighter EMTs, paramedics, EMTs, dispatchers, very dedicated women and men working here 24/7, 365 for the Fire Department Office of Emergency Management.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, Commissioner. And thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Council Member. And Commissioner, I have a question for you, and it's kind of a follow-up to my colleague, Council Member Gilmore Richardson's question. Over the next 4 years, do you have any idea how many firefighters, EMTs are in drop?
We know how many are in drop today, but we don't know what the impact is of the long-term impact of COVID on our workforce might be. Of course, some of you may have heard of this long COVID. Even folks who've had COVID and recovered from it have longer term signs and symptoms and things that frankly might be incompatible with the physical demands of our work. So we are concerned about what it looks like going forward. From drop and other types of retirements and separations, we lose somewhere between 70 and 80 personnel, every uniform staff every year, which is why it takes us one class of 100 just to cover that attrition. And then as we try to build up to that ultimate authorized position strength, so we're not always using overtime to fill the very reasonable and anticipated daily vacancies that occur for us on a 24/7, 365 basis.
Have you seen any increase in the retirement over the last 2 years?
No, it's stayed pretty steady, but I am concerned about the future, just given our folks really have been working. They always work hard. Our core mission, obviously, as you heard me say, the second busiest fire EMS department in the nation. With COVID and the additional missions and with the disaster responses, and it's just incredible to me that our folks are still doing what they're doing, which is out there serving without fail, 24/7. I am concerned about how long we can do this at the current pace without additional resources.
Okay, thank you very much. Any other questions for Commissioner Hill? Yes.
Yes, Mr. Chair.
You're recognized, Councilmember Gilmore.
Thank you so much. I have one additional question just to piggyback off of your question. Although you may not know how many are signed up for drops.
I kind of take everything.
Do you know how many of your employees are eligible for retirement within the next 5 years?
Council member, I don't have that number, but we can certainly get it to you.
Okay, that'll be helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Commissioner Thiel, thanks for your testimony today. Seeing no further questions, we appreciate you being here, and thank you very much, and stay safe out there. And thank your department. I will say this, every interaction I've had with a member of EMT Fire, they're the best. They're really good people, and they're doing a great job helping us. So thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. And check your smoke alarms.
Okay, thanks. All right, next, before we get to the prisons, I wanted to ask Commissioner Coulter the same question I asked Commissioner Thiel. Is Commissioner Coulter still on?
Yes, sir, I'm still here.
Okay, do you have any, I think you mentioned, if I recall, like 384 positions are open in the police department?
It's higher than that. We're at about 500 now.
500, okay.
That's our sworn positions, and we have additional issues like Commissioner Thiel mentioned in dispatch and a lot of our civilian positions as well. Yeah,
so as I'm sure my colleagues are concerned, going forward in the next 4 years, what are we looking at? For example, how many are in drop, and as my colleague Councilmember Merchant said, how many are eligible for drop? Like, what is that going to look like, and how do we make sure we have a pipeline to fill all these great jobs in the city?
Well, our numbers in the drop are on average about 120 a year. They're the ones that we know are leaving, moving forward for the 3 years. And we did the 4 years, but this year we're already in progress. So this year we had about, I think, 118 that were in the drop. When it comes to drop eligibility, more than 50% of our department would be drop eligible, depending on what contract you're in, because we have different pension plans and some are 45, some are 50. But we have a large number who won't be eligible for years, but a large number who's eligible today. And it's just a decision as to when they decide to leave. And the drop's a great indicator to give you what you know you're going to lose. But arguably every year that number's probably double what's in the drop, where people either take other employment, they have an illness, they, move for different reasons, whether it's a family illness or relocation. So the drop number to me is scary enough. The real number, scares you even more because it's the unknown that you try to plan for, because on average years, we used to treat about 12 people a month. And those numbers have grown specifically in the last 2 years, and not attributed to any one source, but it's been a rough time in policing. There's been a pandemic. There's people, our cops and supervisors are people. They have the same family issues that everybody else has. So we have seen greater numbers of younger and older employees leave, the employment here to take, either other jobs or early retirements. So, we are robustly recruiting. We are obviously limited to the city of Philadelphia, so we are working hard to make sure that we make this job appealing and get into the communities and actually meet people where they are and let them see that this is, despite what Commissioner Thiel says, the greatest job in the world. So I think policing has so many rewards available, so many opportunities for folks, but to just get them in the door, to get them to see what many of us have gotten to see over the years. But my lieutenant just gave me my number for the drop for the 5 years. It's 929 for the next 5.
Wow. And so I guess the question is, how do we prepare ourselves? How do we recruit more? What can we do to help you? Because it's not just fire, it's also police that I think we're all concerned about. Are we going to have enough people in that pipeline to fill those jobs?
Right. Well, I think it's everybody's responsibility, obviously police and police recruitment, but it's also everybody that sits in a seat in council and anywhere else in city government and in our families. I mean, policing, despite what some people hear or how the climate is right now, is a very noble profession if you do it honorably. And to encourage our sons and daughters and nieces and nephews to become part of this is to expect a small unit to recruit those folks, especially if there's not that hey, we support you in it. I mean, I didn't tell my family I was becoming a cop till the night before I went into the police academy because I really did not believe that they would accept it or be happy about it. Turned out that they were way better about it than I had given them credit for. But at the end, I think our young folks need to know that, their family supports them. And, we're all working towards necessary change. To encourage people to be part of that change, I think, is the responsibility of everybody who wants to make sure Philadelphia get safer and then stay safe.
Do we have any kind of written plan as to how we're going to backfill all these positions that are open now and over the next 4 or 5 years? Because it sounds to me like this could be a real issue for us.
It could be, and it could be for quite some time. Now, we currently and have ongoing recruitment drives. We keep, our situation open that we're getting people in, and we're getting candidates. I don't know that we will get the number of qualified candidates in those years because there's a lot of state rules and regulations that are beyond the control of the police department that would prohibit somebody from becoming a cop. One of our larger concerns, and we are working with the Police Foundation and some other folks to evaluate the test to come on, which is the Nelson-Denny test, that we believe that test could be biased. We think that, we're going to be turning away city kids because, they may not be that familiar with Chaucer. But at the end of the day, they could certainly provide a good service. So we have folks that are working on that now because there is rumors that the state will raise the reading level to 11th grade. And we have a lot of folks who have graduated from high school struggling to read at a 9th grade level. So those are the things that are barriers that we can't control because it's a state requirement that they must pass the test and they must to enter into the next phases. But we're looking at it from every angle to say, how can we make that test fair? And then by doing so, we will have more people that will qualify and come in. But at the end of the day, we have a population of 1.5 million, and those positions must be filled by people who, live here and have lived here for a year. So there will be challenges, but I know that Deputy Wimberly in our recruitment section, and every one of us takes that plan to say, hey, how many do we need in the next class, And it also challenge, just like fire, it takes 9 months to get out of the academy. So once we hire them, we don't get that relief immediately. And, we use our class 100, which is our lap salary, to make up those vacancies for bodies that we don't have to put on the street. But even that, after some time, has a diminishing return because you can only ask cops to work so many extended shifts and days off before that fatigue sets in and then they're not able to do it 7 days a week. So we do need to fix it. We're, obviously working in city government to find a way to get people hired quickly. And it's a full commitment, but it's not something that you can make somebody do. They have to want to be a cop. And our job is to make it too visible to the public that this is a great job and it's a great opportunity for them to make a difference in their city.
Do you think, Commissioner Coulter, that at some point we should consider as a city dedicating 1, 2, whatever number of high schools we need, 9th to 12th grade for police, fire, emergency training, EMTs, and just have a total dedication in those schools for those positions, even understanding that I think, is it the minimum age for police, is it 21?
It's 22, sir.
22. So we'd have to have some sort of program that goes from 18 to 22. Also, maybe we create a new category, but where we actually offer people a career path and a track so we make sure that they can qualify for these jobs and we train them because these are good jobs and they're jobs that have a lot of pride to them. They have good pay and they're sustaining jobs. But I'm just want to see if we can make sure that pipeline comes out of the city. I think without doing that, it's going to be a struggle.
And I think having that dedication I'm saying probably by the 8th grade level, because a lot of our folks just make mistakes at young ages that the state is very unforgiving. Like there's rules about carrying a firearm and things like that you could never be a cop no matter how much you turned your life around. That if we get them at an early point and show them the pathway to this opportunity, we may be able to keep them from ever making those mistakes that would keep them out of arguably the greatest profession in America.
If you could just find out for us, let us know if there are any other municipalities, cities that actually have that type of situation, 9th to 12th grade. I'd be curious to know how they're doing it.
I believe I saw one at Major City Chiefs and maybe San Diego, but I will look up to see the ones that have them and to see how successful they are in keeping those children in the pipeline. because at the end of the day, it's still their choice, and what we do for that gap 4 years as to whether there's some type of auxiliary position or something that we can move them into city employment before they're eligible to join the department.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions at this point?
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Yeah, I apologize. I have to get the chat feature working today. But I just wanted to go back, Christine Coulter, first to thank you for sharing your story about how you applied for the police department. It's a little known story, and I don't think I ever told this publicly, that I considered being a police officer very early in my career. And I went back and told my mom, and she said, listen, I also took the test and went through the process and did the psychological exam, and your father asked me not to move forward in the process because he was afraid of his wife being a police officer. But I also considered that as a career very early in my career. So thank you for sharing your story, because it's stories like that that will help young people want to go into a career in law enforcement. You stated 929 police officers are eligible or already enrolled in DROP over the next 4 years?
Next 5 years.
Next 5 years. So how many are eligible for retirement? That's my question.
Probably another 2,000 more.
Okay.
That's approximate. I can get that exact number, because you really have to go through each individual contract that they were hired under, because there's different ages, whether it's 45, 50, or 55, depending on what point you were hired by the city.
Okay, and then I recently, this summer, visited with the Police Explorers program, and visited with the young people who are a part of the program. And I understand that they do receive a point preference when they apply. But is it a several years sort of break in there, because they're in the program potentially when they're in high school, but they can't apply until a certain age? So how are you sort of keeping track of those young people?
Well, we allow them to stay in Explorers till they're 21, so we keep that, kind of connection and hold until they can apply. But it is challenging, because there's folks that, at the end of the day, if you don't go to a 4-year college, you need a job. So whether you go work for PICA or the water department or Comcast or somewhere that doesn't require you to be 22 years old, it creates that. And now you have 2-3 years with a company. Do we get them back? Only about, I think the last time we looked, is only about 20% of our explorers do become police officers. A lot of them choose military careers, firefighter, other noble things. It's not like there's a commitment that you must stay with us. I mean, the ultimate goal of Explorers, although it is a great feeding tool, is to just help create great young men and women who will do great things no matter what job they take. But even the number of Explorers could never support our number of vacancies, that we have so many folks and, a couple hundred people involved in our Explorer program. They're not going to be able to take that whole lion's share, that we have to find a way to get other folks and get them involved early on, and then keep them involved until they're of age.
Yeah, I wanted to really double down on the comments that my colleague, Councilmember Dom, made around our overall readiness for any potential employment shortage, particularly in this department, so that we ensure on the front end we're doing all that we can around recruitment and ensuring that we can get young people who live in the city of Philadelphia and others in the pipeline for this position, knowing that there's a potential for a number of individuals to retire or leave all at the same time. And in addition to that, I think, the overall concern is that, are we doing enough? Are we doing enough currently? Meaning, how are we all supporting the Police Explorers program in this particular budget? What additional things can we do for that program? How are you all interfacing with the school district, knowing that the residency requirement is in now? How are you supporting the school district to create this pipeline of young people as well? So I'm just very concerned about that, because we know that these number of vacancies are pending or could be pending, and we need to be ready on the front end versus scrambling, for staff on the back end.
Right, and it's something that keeps me up at night, Councilwoman. So I can tell you that it's a real concern, because it's not a job that appeals to everybody. So you really have to look to find those that may have an interest and then get them to be wanting to be part of the team. But when you're dealing with the school districts, it's that 4-year gap once they leave. There's people who we can meet at, 11th grade at Ben Franklin and have them on board. but at the end, they'd have to do something else for those 4 years if they don't go to a 4-year college. So we're looking to do some work with community college to get some folks there in their criminal justice program as a feeder, because now they're closer in age. And we may have to look at some point to a charter change to dial back that age a little. One of the things that we compete with is the state police is 21. So we have some folks that are in both pipelines, but they can get hired sooner somewhere else, and it's a civil service age right now of 22. That may be something, and I have to be honest, I'm not really certain how I feel about it, because it's an awesome responsibility to give somebody with very little life experience a gun, the ability to take somebody's life or their freedom without having other things to draw from. So you have to be careful how low you go to ensure that there is some type of life and work experience before we put folks, like, yes, they're trained for 9 months, but the training is just the tip of the iceberg. Once you're out there, in the real world dealing with real issues, it helps to have life experience to draw on, and not just, having come out of high school and joined the ranks of policing.
No, I completely understand. I also just wanted to mention that this impacts our overtime, though, because, the staffing ratios, it will impact overtime over time. So we have to plan for that. And I'd be more than happy to explore, any potential changes with you around the age requirement, and anything more we could do to help our young people get in the pipeline, which is why, and I'm going to put in a plug for this bill, I introduced the bill to give young people who are graduates of the school district a point preference when they apply for positions with the city of Philadelphia. And I know we received a lot of pushback on that bill, but it's important for us to ensure that we can create a pipeline and a pathway to city employment for all of our young people here in the city of Philadelphia. So thank you very much, Deputy Commissioner Coulter, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councilmember. Commissioner Coulter, thank you for being here again. And on behalf of everybody, I want to thank you for your service. Thank the Commissioner Outlaw and the whole department. We appreciate the police, and really, we need the police, and very appreciative. And the more we can do to support you, let us know. We want to make sure that you have enough people to staff the city correctly. So thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you, Councilman.
Let's go to our next panelist, which I believe is from the Commissioner of Prisons had to leave, Blanche Carney, but I believe the Deputy Commissioner is here for the testimony. So I'd like to call on the Deputy Commissioner for, is that Xavier Buford? You can give the testimony.
Yes, Councilmember Dom. Good afternoon, Councilmember Dom, other council members and colleagues that are on this hearing. I am Xavier Buford, Deputy Commissioner for the Prisons, here to speak on Resolution 200406, the resolution authorizing the Committee on Fiscal Stability and Intergovernmental Cooperation to hold quarterly hearings that include monthly reporting requirements to discuss the fiscal positioning, overarching social impact goals of the city, including as related to the 5-year plan. The prisons had an adopted plan of $222 million, and we came in at 218. Some of that savings was due to attrition of staff that have retired, resigned, just went to other places, and also some of the savings were done on our cut of inmate work plans due to COVID mitigation practices. I'm here to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Deputy Commissioner. I do have 2 quick questions for you. I think in August, the department received a letter from the Pennsylvania Prison Society raising some big concerns about the management of the prisons and the conditions of the people that were working and living there. Can you talk about the department's management and performance in the wake of that letter, and give us a sense for next steps, and what can our council do to help you here?
Well, currently, Councilmember Dom, the conditions of the prisons are that we continue with our COVID mitigation efforts of keeping the prisons as clean as possible. We run cleaning regiments throughout the entire day and evening to try to keep our cases down. And we will continue with that. That is something that we've always done, but we have just stepped up the efforts due to COVID-19. With that being said, at times due to our staffing problems, the inmates were not getting out as much as they should have been. So we have come up with a plan to work on that to make sure that they get the time out. As many people know, we are under some court litigation right now that calls for that. So that also getting the inmates out of the cells to clean their living spaces also helps with the mitigation practices. We just ask that council still just keep supporting us and what we're doing to keep the jails running safely.
And I know you're referencing, I think it was a federal judge maybe 2 weeks ago. In an order they filed, they required the prisons, I guess, to ramp up hiring, ease the pandemic lockdowns, institute staff COVID-19 testing, and try to get back to more normal operations. Are we in compliance with that court mandated requirement?
Well, we've ramped up our hiring efforts. As a matter of fact, just 2 days ago, I was on a virtual hiring bazaar with the Community College of Philadelphia, and we have OHR. We're partnering with several agencies throughout the city, just basically piggybacking on some of their hiring bazaars that we may be able to get in and help with, us getting staff on board also. So we have a all-out blitz going on, and if I can plug, as the Commissioner Teal did, currently the prisons has an opening on the phila.gov website. It doesn't close until October 15th. So please, if you know anyone that is interested, we encourage them to sign on for the prisons.
How many openings do you have right now?
Currently, for uniform positions, there are about 400.
Unbelievable. Okay. It sounds to me like between prisons, fire, and police, we could have close to 1,500 positions available.
Yes, and as we all know historically, the prisons is like the stepping stone of law enforcement. Once people get in, they use that pipeline to some people, not all, because I stayed for 27 years, but they use that pipeline, of course, to morph into the police department, morph into the sheriffs, morph into state police, or even the fire department. And that's historically been the track of the prisons. So we just try to keep people, keep the position as attractive as possible and get as many people in as we possibly can. COVID has made it very difficult.
Okay, so thank you. And so just to go back to that question, are we in compliance with the court mandated operations? Would you say yes or no, or working towards it?
We are definitely partially in compliance with most of the court mandated operations, and we're working towards the other items that need to be done that the plaintiffs' counsel have been asking for. So we are definitely working towards everything that they're asking for.
One last question for you. Is there any way to include new measures in the QCMR that address the conditions for workers and the inmate population going forward? Is that possible?
I think it is. I believe it is possible. Just so for all transparency, so that it can be shown and seen. I believe we can put that in to show what we are doing.
Yeah, I think that would be very helpful to see that. So thank you very much. Thank you for your testimony today, and please pass on to the commissioner and the whole department our appreciation for all the work you guys are doing. And I know this has not been easy during COVID. This is really challenging. So we do appreciate all of you. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Next, we'd like to call Deputy Director for Streets, Christopher Newman.
Good afternoon, Councilman Dom and members of City Council. My name is Christopher Newman. I'm Deputy Commissioner for Administration for the Philadelphia Streets Department. I'm here today to testify on resolution number 200406, which calls for hearings to discuss the fiscal position and overarching social impact goals of the city, including, and as related to the 5-year plan, and the reporting requirements set forth in the quarterly manager's report and PICA. The quarterly manager's report for the fourth quarter of FY21, which ended 6/30/21, shows the streets projected spend at $163.5 million, which is unchanged from the projection from last quarter. Thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have at this time.
Thank you, Deputy Commissioner. I actually do have a few questions for you, so thanks
Sure.
for giving me the time to do that. I want to talk to you for a minute about, I know we have to install these ADA ramps all over the city to get into compliance with the law. But it looks like we've paved like in 0 miles in the fourth quarter of fiscal year 21, according to the report. Isn't that typically the peak paving season? And I just want to make sure that we're not deferring so much of the maintenance, so we end up causing more infrastructure and budget issues kind of down the road.
Yeah, so that's part of our peak paving season. It goes from April all the way through November every year. So that fourth quarter would have represented a good chunk of what we would have normally done for paving. The ADA ramp situation held us back, and some funding issues also held us back for the fourth quarter.
So we didn't pave any streets in the fourth quarter.
I think we did pave some, but I don't have a number for you today, but I do believe we paved some. We ended up doing about 56 miles for the whole fiscal year of FY21, which, I'm sorry, it was 52 miles, and we had a 56-mile target for that fiscal year. So
Okay.
we came under, but it wasn't that low under. And the reason why we came under was because of the ADA issues that we have talked to you about several different.
Understood. Was there any opportunity for federal infrastructure dollars to help us here?
There is now with the infrastructure bill, so we're hoping that we get a lot of money in that regard to actually help us out. And a lot of what we're asking for and we're hoping to get is a lot more money for that purpose.
What do you think our chances of getting the money, and how much potential money is there if we get it?
That's above my pay grade, Councilman. I don't know. I'm not really sure how much we could get for that.
In the millions or less, or what are we looking at?
I would imagine it would be in the tens of millions. Yes.
So we have to put whatever resources we can towards that application process and push whatever we can to get that money, because that'll be a nice benefit for us.
Yes, it would.
Okay. Second question: are we seeing any leveling out? I know last year we talked about this, the refuse tonnage, that people were continuing to work from home, and our refuse tonnage picked up. Has that leveled out? Has it gone down? Where do we stand with that?
That's an interesting story, because we actually thought it would start leveling out when people started going back to work last winter, last spring. It actually didn't. If you look at the peak season for fiscal year FY21 and compare it to peak season for FY20, it actually went up a bit. However, since July, we have some good news. It looks like it is trending down. Over the last 2 months, July and August, it's gone down 6%. So we're hoping that trend continues, and if it does, it will actually reduce about a little over 44,000 tons of trash, which represents about $3 to $4 million in savings, which would be significant for us.
Refresh my memory. What was the total increase from like 19 to 20 because of the pandemic?
We went from 610,000, I believe, to a little over 700,000. And then this past fiscal year, FY21, we hit 741,000 tons.
So theoretically, we could say as people go back to work, this trash should go down, because the trash will be in their office buildings, which are commercial trash haulers.
We've been waiting for that to occur. And like I said, we actually thought it was going to start earlier last fiscal year. It did not. We're hoping that the trends that we're seeing now just are constant. We think, my own personal opinion is positive, and I think it's going to continue, because people are back to work and back to school. So we should see that have some sort of impact.
Next question is, no pun intended here, but as this body, council I'm referring to, paved the way for outdoor dining about 18 months ago. I just want to thank you, your department, everyone in the streets. You guys, I think, did an excellent job in helping the city get through this. And it's really important as we advance this year that we discuss your needs to implement a successful enforcement program for the outdoor dining. And we're going to be talking about more of that in the near future. But I will also just want to thank you on behalf of my staff and everyone in the hospitality work group and all my colleagues for the tremendous cooperation and work you all did to make that outdoor dining possible. You guys did a great job. So thank you very much.
Thank you for saying that, Councilman, and I'll convey that to the Deputy Commissioner for Transportation and his team, because they worked really hard over a short period of time to get that moving.
That was a lifesaver for the city. I always say in the 18 months that we've been in this pandemic, there were very few things we all did that were fun, but eating outside gave us a little fun in this pandemic. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you for saying that.
Sure. So I don't see any more questions, so thank you for your testimony today, and please thank everybody in the department for all their great work. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next up is the Acting Commissioner, Departments of Licensing and Inspections, Ralph DePietro.
Good afternoon, Councilmember Dom and members of City Council. My name is Ralph DePietro. I'm the Acting Commissioner of the Department of Licenses and Inspection. I'm here today to testify on resolution number 200406, which calls for hearings to discuss the fiscal position and overarching social impact goals of the city, including and as related to the 5-year plan and the reporting requirements set forth in the quarterly city manager's report, and as submitted to the Pennsylvania Intergovernmental Cooperation Authority, PICA. The quarterly city manager's report for the fourth quarter of FY21, which ended in June 30th, 2021, shows the projected L&I spend at $38 million, which aligns with what was budgeted and is unchanged from the projections from last year. Thank you for the opportunity. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Commissioner. And I just want to have a few comments, not many, but kind of amazing. It looks like you managed to triple the rate at your approval of residential permits, and which is phenomenal. I'm just wondering how you did that, because you tripled it, which is amazing to me. So how'd that happen?
Part of that is, believe it or not, some of that working, the working from home for the plans examiner was actually beneficial. We've seen some productivity increases, which sort of seems contrary, right? You would imagine they'd be less productive, but it was a little bit slow starting, and so we've seen some increased productivity there. But we've also seen a lot of that due to the ability to shorten the time frame of interaction. Very typically, plans and permits fail their first review. It's very common. What would normally happen is that would create a lengthy resubmission process. We would notify the applicant, they'd gather the documents, they'd come to MSB, go through all that. With Eclipse, with our system Eclipse, they're available 24/7. We email them their requirements. It's on their online portal. They can submit it in the middle of the night if they get if they happen to be up, and it's shortened that time frame. So I think that those two things really help to shorten that. And I think there's some more that we're able to do with some of the new functionality. We're bringing the chat function online, and that's really helpful for folks and this is really residential permitting, that don't apply for permits regularly. They may get 1 or 2 a year, and they're not quite sure how to navigate the process. So the chat function, I think, will help to shorten that time frame even further.
Okay, that's great. And so, second question is, from your success on the approving the residential permits, what are the lessons we can learn from that to improve the commercial permitting? It doesn't look like there's as much progress in that area as residential.
Yeah, typically commercial gets to be a little bit more complicated simply because there's zoning implications and there's much larger sort of projects. But I think one thing that we learned, transparency is really a helpful tool in terms of making our process more easily understood. The goal of L&I is to encourage people to get building permits. We want people to get permits. There's all kinds of estimates about how much work sort of goes on without permits. And certainly much of that is true, but we really do want to encourage people to get permits. It's the safest way to ensure that construction is done safely. So I think we need to look at ways we are more transparent in terms of our requirements. I think there's some technology upgrades. We've committed to investing as much as possible in our technology upgrades, improvements to the website. I think that'll help with commercial permitting. I think predictability, as we've talked about before, is typically not a good word, but for us, it's a really good word. Folks should understand that the process will be a certain way. I think that also helps. It's kind of commercial permit applications. You have to kind of approach from a bunch of different perspectives because they really run the gamut from renovating a small restaurant to building a high-rise building. And so certainly not one solution will fit all those possibilities. But I think that coupled with some increasing in our plans examination staff will go a long way towards cutting down the commercial permitting times.
Okay, thank you. Last question I have for you. I know that the abatement's changing this year, I believe. So I think starting January 1st, the abatement changes.
Yes, sir.
And so do you expect a ramp up in permit requests as we get closer to the abatement changes taking effect in January? How are you preparing for it? And is there anything you want to share with the public? Because I'd heard at one point that we wanted people to file their permits by, is it October 1st, or share that information if you could.
Yes, sir. So the goal there is to ensure that their project is completed in time to qualify for the abatement. We did that. We have seen some increased. There was a couple things happening here. If you look at our overall sort of reporting, the actual number of permits is down, even though revenues are higher than they've ever been. Part of that's because we've done some work to combine permitting, and so we reduced the need to issue additional permits. So I think in terms of the sort of, we were expecting some level of increased activity, and that's come true to some extent. But I think it's certainly within our capabilities to handle. Although I do encourage folks to get their applications in sooner in the event that there is some kind of last minute push. But based on what we're seeing on the zoning permits, are usually a good indicator of what's going to happen here. We look at zoning permits as a really good indicator of construction strength overall in the city, and they've sort of been they're up overall, but they've sort of been very stable. So I think. While we do expect some level of increase, I don't think it's anything that we can't handle. But again, just because the process can be lengthy for commercial projects, it's probably better that they submit their permit application sooner rather than later. Because the other thing is, the end of the year, you always wind up with with leave issues and personnel issues, and our folks have been working, as I mentioned during our last meeting, throughout the pandemic. They're certainly stressed. We're seeing that a little bit in our leave usage. There's certainly some stress to that. I think that's also coupled with working from home, which is good in many ways, but it's also we've seen it can have a drawback. For example, your workplace and your home become the same. That's a lot for people to handle. You have no place to go to hide from your work. So we sort of have to factor that in when we think about how much more capacity we'll have available for additional applications. But I'm confident we can handle it.
All right. Well, thank you very much, and keep up the great work. Thank you, and thank your department for all the great work. This is all positive things, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
I don't see any other questions. Oh, I do see a question from Councilmember Gim for our prisons. Good afternoon, Councilmember Gim. I think the Deputy Commissioner from Prisons, is he still? Here he is. Yes, Xavier. Yes. Okay. I think Councilmember Gim has a question for you.
Yes, thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. I just wanted to follow up on Chairperson Dom's inquiry about compliance and the federal order. You said that your department is in partial compliance. Could you clarify that a little bit more?
Yes. What I mean by that, the time out of cell, we try to maintain the time out of cell time for the inmates. And what that means is the actual time that they get out to get phones, showers, recreation in the yards, weather permitting, things like that. When we are short of staff, sometimes that gets impacted, and the time out of cell is not as long as required by the courts. Right now, the requirement is at least 3 hours. There are days that we don't make that at some of the facilities, but they at least get the hour out to do what they need to do. That's what I mean by the time out of cell.
Okay. And then are there areas where the department is still working on, is that the primary area, that the honoring the full length of time out of cell?
Yes, that is the biggest goal, because if everyone doesn't know, when we do have the inmate population out, it just makes the day easier for everybody because all of the scheduled activities, programs, and things like that that could be running are running without a hitch. Of course, official visiting, regular visiting when it was available, things like that. So that's why that's our biggest goal.
Okay. And does the department have a timeline about, what you are expecting? I mean, look, I know a lot of this has to do with your staffing issues and all of that, but is there a timeline that you have?
We can't put a timeline on it, but what we can say is that we just graduated a small class roughly 2.5 weeks ago. We have a class in the academy right now, and we're going to keep running classes as much as we can to get our numbers up. Getting the numbers up and the staffing will, of course, aid us in making sure that we are in compliance with the federal order.
And there are allegations that some individuals have not been let out of cells for days. Is that something that you can confirm or contest?
Now, anytime we hear that, the first thing we do is we investigate to make sure that that is not happening. If anyone does have that, we usually go back to our logs to make sure that we log showers, we log phone calls, we log recreation to make sure that this did happen. So anybody that we get and the complaints that we get, from family members or whoever, we jump right on it when we do get those complaints.
And then my final question is, I know that there's been efforts around staffing. Do you know what efforts have been made about reducing the number of individuals that are currently being held, whether it's like through increased bail? Has your department or division been active in working with the municipal courts to speed things up through alternative measures and make sure people get their initial hearing so that they can be out? I mean, obviously, the vast majority of individuals are pretrial. They have not been convicted. So are you working closely with, what are you aware of in terms of efforts being made to reduce the number of people who are in your facilities?
And yes, and working with the criminal justice partners, and we just had some meetings on it, just making sure that like the big three, which helps get inmates out of custody, the bench warrant hearings, the early bail releases, and the GAG 91 hearings, making sure that they get heard. A lot of them can be heard virtually. We have stood up virtual capabilities throughout all of the facilities so the courts could work in getting these guys out. Those have all been big factors in trying to reduce the inmate population.
Okay. Obviously we are tracking this because it's an important issue for us, and it does have financial implications because of the court mandate. So thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much, Deputy Commissioner Buford.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember. Again, great questions. Thank you. And so I don't believe there's any other questions. So I want to thank all the witnesses for being here today and for your insight. We appreciate your testimony today and look forward to working with you in the future. And again, I want to say we're going to be here and continue to report out on our financial position and performance again. I know one of the more important things that I'd like to see happen from this meeting today is that plan for the violence prevention and how we're going to evaluate and measure it. Because clearly right now, the number one issue for all of us in the city is violence prevention. Do I feel safe living in the city? And we have to make sure that that happens. That is key for all of us. So we're committed to it. We're going to make it happen. Thank you all for being here today. And I look forward to seeing you soon, hopefully in person. Thank you very much. Take care.